Some weeks ago, actually, it's been months that Mr. LaRouche has been talking about the Manhattan Project. But in specific, he began a discussion about what he kept calling the American presidency. And importantly, this discussion that's happened recently around Martin O'Malley brought up something. One person who texted me after the last phone call of Thursday and got on somewhat late said in the text, "Why is Mr. LaRouche supporting Martin O'Malley?" And I responded, Lyndon LaRouche is not supporting Martin O'Malley. Martin O'Malley is supporting Glass-Steagall. And this is a campaign that this particular individual knew that Lyndon LaRouche initiated. His organization, many people here are very familiar with this. You know that this is the discussion that began back in 2007, 2008. But that O'Malley is supporting the presidency supporting Glass-Steagall. No one else is doing that. So what has happened is that the concept of the presidency as a philosophical principle, as exactly the idea that Friedrich Schiller put forward about the idea of the philosophical mind, which comes into convergence with its time, with a conception that it can apply to change the world for the better. This is what the American presidency was and is. So to begin the discussion on this, we have two speakers. The first I want to introduce now, Bob Ingraham, historian and author. He's discussing his recent article, and you can get this in the back, Manhattan's Struggle for Human Freedom Against the Slave Power of Virginia. Bob?
Well, Dennis and I stayed up late last night talking about all this, and then what he does is he turns around and gives half my presentation. So I want to talk about the presidency, and because here we have Decision Day for Humanity. The U.S. must return to its founding principles and join the BRICS alliance. Okay, that immediately poses several questions. What are the founding principles of the United States? A lot of people think they know what they are. A lot of people have some ideas, some inkling, something deep in their soul. And then we must return to those founding principles. How do we do that? Because, look, I'm sure there are many people here and many people who are watching and listening around the country and elsewhere who have been involved in the fight to rescue this nation from Obama, from Bush, from what has been going on, and who have been fighting and fighting and fighting. And people ask, how can we possibly win this fight? The institutions are so corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. Now, recently, Lyndon LaRouche has talked about that we are in a transitional period. We are in a transitional period in which our job, not someone else's job, our job is to bring into existence a new presidency, or to recreate the presidency, the true presidency of the United States. Now, this then poses the question, what is the presidency? And a lot of people, when you ask them about the presidency, they'll scratch their head and think about something they learned in school. Well, it's one of three branches of governments. We have checks and balances. It's one of three branches of government: the legislative, the judicial, the executive. They'll say something like that. Or they'll talk about a candidate, O'Malley or someone else, a candidate as a presidential candidate. Or maybe they might talk about the institution of the presidency, which gets closer to it, in terms of the institution of the presidency, which is a broad executive power within the nation, which has the ability to direct overall policy for the nation. So they might even go that far. But none of that is really adequate, and none of that really encompasses what the American presidency is. This is something which is embedded in our Constitution. It was embedded by the same people, namely Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, and they had allies, but they were the two key people at the Constitutional Convention who were responsible for the preamble of our Constitution. Now, I'll get back to this question of the presidency I just got to keep an eye on the time. If I run, can you, tell me if I'm going too long? But look, first of all, why don't we deal with this question of the nation must return to its founding principles? There's a lot of myths. There's a lot of stories about America, right? Now, in recent days, in the recent years, it has become sort of trendy or accepted to accept the view that American history is a long litany of the racist white man oppressing, raping, and murdering people of color, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. That this is our true heritage, right? This is what kids get this in school, that we killed the Indians, we enslaved the black man, we did this, we did that. Now, of course, we're raping the earth, we're doing all these horrible things. One of the ways in which this myth has been most pernicious is on the question of slavery. What has been said by leftist historians and others, and it's many people believe it, is that in the United States, either one of two things went on at the beginning in regards to slavery. Number one, that all of the founding fathers, or almost all of them, were pro-slavery, that they were just pro-slavery. They owned slaves, they were pro-slavery. Or they were indifferent to it. They didn't care about it at the very least. And then the second side to this is that their slavery was not really a very big issue back then. That there were other things on their minds, and there weren't that many slaves, and no one really cared about it in 1776 or 1789 or 1788 at the Constitutional Convention, and that therefore, and that it did not really become an issue until later, until the 19th century. The Missouri Compromise at the earliest, and even that seemed to have been dealt with. So really you have to go into the 1830s, 40s, 50s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision. This is when slavery became a crisis. And now look, none of that is true. Not a word of it. Not one shred, not one iota of either of those two ideas is true. They are both absolute, outright lies. From the very beginning of this country, there was an intense fight against slavery. And it was led by the people who later, in 1789, became the leaders of the George Washington administration. Almost entirely, these people were New Yorkers, Manhattanites. Alexander Hamilton, of course, the leader, and his close friends and associates, Gouverneur Morris, John Jay, Stephen Van Rensselaer, and others. These were the people who founded the New York Manumission Society for the abolition of slavery. And they were not abolitionists per se, not like the later abolitionists of the 1850s, in the sense that they just said, well, slavery is morally wrong. Yes, they recognized that slavery was morally wrong. But what they also recognized was that, on the one hand, that the enslavement, the forcing into bondage other human beings, was a policy of empire and was absolutely incompatible both with the principles of the American Revolution and with what they were trying to create with the new republic at the Constitutional Convention. And at the same time, they also recognized that if they did not stop it, that the slaveocracy within this country would ultimately destroy the United States. Abraham Lincoln said much later, country cannot exist half slave, half free. Hamilton, Morris, Jay, and others knew that in 1788. And they knew that this was a danger that had to be defeated. Now, there was a huge fight at the Constitutional Convention over slavery. And I will read to you, these, I think, are yours or Helga's. I will read to you a quote, which some of you, if you've read, those of you who've seen my article might have seen this quote. It's a little long, but I want to read the whole thing. This is from a speech that Gouverneur Morris, who's from New York, his grave is up in the Bronx, and this is from a speech he gave at the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787. And this is when they're debating whether or not the South should be allowed to count slaves towards how many representatives they got in the government. And this is what Morris says. Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in Philadelphia are worth more than all the wretched slaves that cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this: that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and, in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice. Domestic slavery is the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of the proposed Constitution. The vassalage of the poor has ever been the favorite offspring of aristocracy. And I'll skip a section. And he says, the southern states, he says, additionally, the southern states are not to be restrained from importing fresh supplies of wretched Africans. Nay, they are to be encouraged to it by an assurance of having their votes in the national government increased in proportion, and are at the same time to have their exports and their slaves exempt from all contributions for the public service. Slavery is a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevails. Compare the free regions of the Middle States, where a rich and noble cultivation marks the prosperity and the happiness of the people, with the misery and poverty which overspread the barren wastes of Virginia, Maryland, and the other states having slaves. I'll skip again. He says, proceed southwardly into the slave region, and every step you take through the great region of slaves presents a desert, increasing with the increasing proportion of these wretched beings. Now, this is a speech which Morris gave at the Constitutional Convention. 25% of the delegates are slave owners. He fought these people tooth and nail. Now, Gouverneur Morris is not just one guy. This is Alexander Hamilton's closest friend. This is one of John Jay's closest friends. These are George Washington's closest allies, the people that Washington chose to lead his new administration. They were determined to wage this fight, to crush the slave power of the South from the beginning, to snuff it out. This is not taught in the history books. Almost nobody knows about it, you know. But this is what was going on. I'm not making this up. This is not my theory. This is the actual true history of the United States of America. Now, as I said, the issue was not slavery per se. You know, it wasn't like these guys said, well, we're morally against slavery, but meanwhile we're going to, you know, have some other ridiculous policies and what have you. what they yesterday on our weekly report, Jason Ross, Helga mentioned it. Jason Ross gave a presentation on Hamilton's 4 reports. And what I'll just say is if you look at the Constitutional Convention itself, and if you look at the first Washington administration, the intention was to create a republic based on, and this seems highfalutin to some people. People think, well, this is like you're going a little far, but not really. Their intention was to create a republic based on a very specific conception of what it means to be a human being. If you look at Hamilton's economic policies opposed to the slaveocracy of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, if you look at Hamilton's economic policies, which are not, policies or programs per se, because everything he proposed and everything he did flowed from a principle in his mind of a conception of what the intent and purpose of the republic was. And his economic policies were not designed to just make people money and, blah, 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 to balance the budget. The report on manufacturers, the Society on the Society for the Establishing Useful Manufacturers, his national credit system. This was all designed to use the sovereign power of the nation to engender, to drive forward, not simply passively, but consciously and deliberately, the rapid scientific, the rapid industrial and technological and manufacturing advancement of the nation, and with that, the advancement of the population. See, sometimes I think it's wrong the way people discuss economic policies, even when they're really talking about good economic policies. Because you don't build a canal or a railroad or anything else just because it's a good economic policy. It has to do with where is the human species going in the future years. What is our intention? What is our desire for our posterity, knowing what the nature of the human species is? And this is what Hamilton was doing. It is what he was doing. And all this stuff about how he was an aristocrat, a banker, all this is all poppycock. You realize Hamilton, John Jay, Morris, they're called aristocrats. They're called monarchists. Who was calling them aristocrats and monarchists? Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Who were they? Slave owners, plantation owners. It's the big lie. You have to be a child. This is history for children to believe this kind of stuff. So what Hamilton was doing with his approach, with his intention, with the report on manufacturers, was to create a situation in which the wealth of the nation would be directed into the most rapid advancement of scientific and industrial expansion, into increasing the productivity of the population, the skill levels of the population, the cognitive levels and potentials of the population, not only now, but for the next generation and the generation beyond that. That is the Hamiltonian principle. That is the Hamiltonian policy. And what they recognized was that their mortal enemy, their deadly enemy, was the Virginia-led slaveocracy. That these were the people who were out to destroy them, and they were out to destroy them. They did everything in their power to destroy them. Now, this, just give me 1 second here. Just 1 second. The Constitutional Convention, and we'll get back. This will take us back to the issue of the presidency. The United States Constitution, in terms of what it ended up being, was really the work of primarily two men, Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, who were best friends from New York. Morris gave the funeral oration at Hamilton's funeral in 1804 at the request of Hamilton's widow. They were the closest of friends and the closest of political collaborators. Collaborators doesn't even do justice to it. At the Constitutional Convention, you had the Virginia Plan. People say Madison was the father of the Constitution. He put forward the Virginia Plan. Now, the Virginia Plan was a complete mess. First of all, what they intended to do, the South, was to embed the power of slavery into the Constitution. They wanted the South to be able to count all their slaves for votes, so that if you had 100,000 slaves in your state, or 500,000 slaves like Virginia, that would all go towards how many representatives you got in Congress. They wanted all of them to be counted. That was in Madison's plan. They wanted no restrictions on the slave trade, none. Keep bringing them in, because as they said, as Morris said in his speech, the more they brought in, the more votes they got, the more power over the nation they got. The more slaves they had, the more they could create political hegemony, power, control over the destiny of the nation. They wanted this in the Constitution, embedded in it. And then, of course, you have the question of the presidency. Now, people say the Virginia Plan has 3 branches of government, but they bear no resemblance to what we have today. In the Virginia Plan, put forward by Madison and Randolph and the other Virginia delegates, the members of Congress are nominated by the state legislatures. People get to vote on them, but the state legislators nominate the members of Congress. So the only people who go to Congress are people who are chosen by the state legislatures to go to Congress. And then, in Madison's plan, it is that Congress which elects the president from one among themselves, right? So, and the president has almost no powers. People say, well, this is sort of like a prime minister system. It actually is much weaker. It's a figurehead. Under the Madison plan, the Virginia plan, the president is a puppet of both the Congress, which elects him and can remove him, and the state legislatures, which pick the Congress. Now, Gouverneur Morris at the convention actually proposed that the president be directly elected by the people. Now, some people think the Electoral College is a good idea because it's, some kind of Republican, halfway station to, protects you from, mob democracy or something. But Morris didn't like it, the Electoral College, and he voted against it and he fought it. Because he said, look, we have an intention for this nation. We have a mission. We have a purpose. And what is required is that we have an executive who directly represents the people. He said Congress is going to become corrupt. There's a lot of money circulating around. There's rich interests. There's aristocratic interests. All kinds of bad things are going to happen. But what we need is a sacred trust between the American people and the president. That the president will represent the people, and it is through the president that the American people can have faith, can have trust, can be assured that there is not only someone fighting for them, not only someone representing their interests, but someone who is standing for the interests of the nation, against sectional interests, against local interests, against moneyed interests, but someone who is going to stand for the principles of the republic that we are creating at this convention. That is what the president is going to be. Now, the fact that we ended up with a strong presidency in the United States, a presidential system, was largely the work of Hamilton and Morris. There were a couple of other people who contributed, but it was Hamilton and Morris who fought for this, I mean, almost all the other proposals, they were weak, they limited powers, Congress elects the president. But the system we ultimately ended up with, except for the Electoral College system, is what Hamilton and Morris fought for. They created it. But Hamilton and Morris did something else at the convention. And you can't understand the American presidency unless you think it through and combine it with this other thing, which is that at the end of the convention, when they had voted on everything, but the convention was still just scraps of paper, with various resolutions, there was a committee appointed to put the whole thing together, to write a unified composition, a unified constitution. And there was a committee appointed to do that. The chairman of the committee was Alexander Hamilton. On the committee was Gouverneur Morris and another man named Rufus King from New York State. There were 5 people on the committee, and 3 of them were Hamilton, Morris, and Rufus King, the majority of the committee. And they wrote the final version of the Constitution. And there's a lot you could say about it because they didn't just write it out in nice prose. They did some things. But the main thing they did is they added something which they had not been asked to write, which was not part of what they had been charged to do. When they came back with the finished Constitution, they said, oh, by the way, we've added a preamble, right? And the preamble was written personally by Gouverneur Morris. That is known for a fact. He wrote it. And that alone, it makes it a disgrace that he's not even taught in American history books. But everyone here, or I hope everyone here, maybe not everyone listening, but certainly, don't tell me I don't have it. Certainly, yeah, here it is. I should. It's actually a disgrace. I can't recite it from memory. I'll read you the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. This was added to the Constitution. It was written by Gouverneur Morris. It was added by Hamilton's committee and was then adopted as part of the final document. This preamble is the most important part of the Constitution. People say, oh, it's an introduction. It's not an introduction. The preamble defines the purpose of the Constitution, the purpose of the new nation, the intent, what they're doing, to establish justice, to protect, to provide, to promote the general welfare, to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and for future generations, for the future of the nation, and really the future of the human race, right? That is the intention of what they are doing. Now, the same people, literally, the same people who wrote that preamble and added it to our Constitution are the same people responsible for establishing the U.S. presidential system, the presidency. It was Morris and Hamilton who did these two things, and no one else. I mean, there were other people, but, they were the leaders. They did it on the spot in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And the only way you can understand the U.S. presidency and understand why, in fact, Morris wanted him to be directly elected, the only way you can understand the U.S. presidency is to place the presidency within the intention of the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. Because the presidency is not a political office per se. It is certainly not a political candidate per se. The presidency is in fact a principle. It is in fact the idea, which sprang from the minds of these people, an idea of the presidency, acting to defend and to promote and to represent the American people and to carry out the charge, the instructions that are in the preamble to the Constitution. And that is the presidency. This intention, the intention which these guys was at the core of their fight against the slave power, right? This intention of what the American Republic was intended to be is embodied in the office of the president. But when people think about the president, they think about a person, a candidate. Look, if you look at the greatest moments in American history, now there have been a lot of good moments. There have been a lot of good people, many of them. But rather than just thinking about the good people, not to take anything away from any of the good people, but you think about the greatest moments, the pinnacles, what you aspire towards, the greatest presidencies in American history. Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. People say, well, these were great men. Yes. But it also is the case that this is the actual presidency. If you think of how those presidents thought and acted, that is the American presidency. Now, in one sense, you could almost say, if you're theological, it's like the spirit becoming flesh. That may seem weird, but it is in a sense the presidency embodies the entire intention of the founding principles of the United States, the Constitution, etc. And this is what was in the Washington administration. Now, I don't know how much time I have. All right. So look, I'll just say in wrapping it up, the wrong way to think about the situation now, as I said, Lynn says we're in a transitional period. Our job is to create the next presidency. That does not mean our job is to go out and rally behind a candidate. First of all, we should never be rallying behind a candidate. We should never be following anybody. That's not what the LaRouche movement is. Our job is to lead. Our job is to lead, and in a certain kind of way, although the presidency and what we need to create is something very real and tangible and concrete, it actually, in order to bring that into existence, the concept of the presidency has to really come from the hearts and minds of the American people. It's in each one of us. It's in each one of us, this concept of what the American nation is intended to be. And to the extent that we all improve on what we're doing, that we all develop qualities of leadership and go out and do what has to be done, the extent to which we individually, in ourselves, represent this presidential principle and go out and fight for it, that is how we will create, a transition out of this Obama nightmare, a transition into a new presidency. But that is really the only thing that makes sense at this point. So anyway, I'm a little over. So, okay? That's it, folks.